You've actually been a critic of the consent view, I think.
Yeah, so the consent principle in sexual relationships just doesn't work. So the idea is that as long as everyone is consenting, it's fine. The problem with that view is that there are so many instances of that not really working. You know, if someone, so we can say, okay, so children can't consent to sex, fine, therefore paedophilia is forbidden. But what about AI child porn, right? What about adults dressing up as children and deliberately imitating children in order to sexually attract other adults? You know, there's so many instances of this which feel instinctively appalling, and that the vast majority of people would immediately be revolted by, but which do technically jump the consent hurdle, right? The consent hurdle also just invites so many other issues to do it. You know, what if a 16-year-old girl, so she's technically legal, but what if the 16-year-old girl has a terrible mental health and is incredibly gullible, is incredibly vulnerable to persuasion by malicious adults, is very unworldly, very unintelligent. I mean, are we really going to say that girl can have sex with as many people as she wants, can, when she turns 18, can appear in porn, you know, like that? It doesn't pass the intuition test, the consent framework. And I think because it doesn't pass the intuition test, because it's obviously not fit for purpose as the sole moral question concerning all of sexual relationships, which are incredibly complicated. I mean, every culture has very complicated norms and laws surrounding sexual relationships, because it's how a society reproduces itself. Like, sexual reproduction is the way that a society continues, and it's everybody's business. Who, you know, if particularly in the age before contraception, if a young woman gets pregnant by some bozo, right, in really bad circumstances, it affects her life. It affects the rest of her life. It affects her family's life. It affects her community's life. This is highly, highly consequential stuff. So obviously societies have always come up with elaborate ways of managing sexual relationships. We are alone in being hubristic enough to think that we can just have the consent model and everything will be fine. And I think that hubris comes from the invention of reliable contraception, you know, as I explained in the case against the sexual revolution. It's apparent that this doesn't really work. And I think that what you're seeing with, say, it was funny you mentioned the consent ads. When we were in Australia recently and we flew in Qantas, and as soon as we entered Australian airspace, I started getting these government ads, because you get Wi-Fi on planes now, right? I started getting these government ads for, like, teaching me about consent. It was very peculiar. And then, of course, we got a land acknowledgement when we landed and everything. Anyway, you know, welcome to Australia. The government has become more interfering, and you've had these sort of news. Because the consent model doesn't work, you've seen people scrambling to try and assemble some other kind of framework that will protect against sexual harm. And sometimes these can be actually more restrictive and authoritarian than the former ones. So, for instance, it's common for age gap discourse is a long-running thing on social media, where feminists will be very condemnatory of even quite small age gaps, like relatively small age gaps between men and women, and regarding these as being exploitative or whatever. I think often these are quite implausible, these arguments, but you end up, because the consent framework doesn't work, you end up layering on top of it all sorts of sort of improvised new moral ideas around sexuality, which are not agreed universally and have not proved to be durable over time, which have basically been invented and jotted down on the back of an envelope, right? And things like, I mean, it is so apparent to everybody that sexual violence continues, despite the fact that we supposedly live in a utopian post-sexual revolution setting, right? And one of the observations that Christopher Lasch, the theorist, made many years ago, which is so true, is that as other institutions that govern morality retreat, as the family retreats, we've become more atomized, and the extended family has become much, much weaker. As the church retreats, obviously we've already spoken about dechristianization, there's this gap there isn't there is no institution there to provide guidance on, for instance, sexual relationships. And so the government steps into the breach. And so the story of the 20th and 21st centuries is the government becoming ever, ever larger and more intrusive and taking on more of the roles that were used to be performed by the church and by the family, and which includes trying to govern sexual morality, not just when it comes to enforcing the law on rape, but actually trying to intrude into the bedroom, as you say, and teach young people. I mean, state education is also part of this as well, right? The state is literally now responsible for educating our children. Teach young people the new framework, but the new framework isn't fit for purpose because the consent model isn't fit for purpose. And so you just end up with this sort of disintegration.